In this video, I will show you how to create, read, update, and delete events using Blazor Web Assembly, SQL Server, and Entity Framework. So here we have the list of the events. We can create events. We can update events. And to delete an event, we can click on the delete button. Then in the next video, I will show you how to display an alert before deleting an event and how to display the events into an agenda. So if I click on delete, we obtain this alert. If I click on no, nothing happens. And if I click on yes, the event will be deleted. And if I click on this switch, we obtain this agenda, and here we have the different events. So to create an event, we can select the days of the event. Then we need to fill this model. We can also select the hours of the event. So let's click on week. Then we can select the hours. We can also update an event. So let's click on this event. So here we can update the event details and we can delete the event. You can find the link of the second video in the description. Now let's create a new project. Then here let's select C# and Web, and let's select ASP.NET Core Web API. Then next, let's call this project Web API, and let's call the solution To Do App. Then next. Then here let's select .NET 9 and let's use HTTPS. Also we need to check this box to use controllers. Let's click on Create. So this is the created project, and by default we have this controller, we have this model, and we have this file. So let's delete them. Then let's create a new database. So we can use Server Explorer. And let's create a new connection. So the server is available on my computer. So we can write dot, then slash, and the instance name, which is in my case SQL Express. Let's select Windows Authentication and we need to trust the server certificate. And let's create a new database. We can call it DB22 for example. Then OK. So here let's click on yes to create this database. Let's expand this connection, let's expand tables, and for the moment we don't have any table. So now we need the connection string that allows us to connect to this database. So we can make a right click, then properties, and let's copy the connection string. Then let's save it in our project. So let's go to appsettings.json. Then here let's create a new section. And let's call it connection strings. Then let's create the first connection string. We can call it default connection, for example. And let's paste the connection string. Then we need to delete the spaces, otherwise we will have an error when we try to connect to the database. Then we need to add Entity Framework packages that allow us to connect to the database using Entity Framework. So let's make a right click on the Web API project, then Manage NuGet Packages, then Browse, and here let's type EF SQL Server. Then let's install this package that allows us to connect to the SQL Server database, and let's install it. Then we need to install another package, which is Entity Framework Tools. So here let's write EF Tools. And let's install this package that allows us to use these commands on the Package Manager console. So let's install it. Now let's close this page. And let's create the DB context class that allows us to connect to the database using Entity Framework. So this is a service. So let's create a new folder. And let's call it services. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it application DB context. Then let's extend the DB context class of entity framework. Let's add the namespace. Then let's create the constructor, so we can use this button. Then let's create the constructor that requires this parameter. Now let's add this class to the service container so it can be used by the other classes of this application. So let's go to program.cs and let's add the application DB context to the service container. So just here we can add builder.services.addDBContext. And we will add this application DB context. So to fix the error, we need just to add the namespace. Then let's configure this function to configure the DB context class to connect to the SQL Server database. So let's provide it with an arrow function. And here we need to read the connection string that we have in appsettings.json. So we can create this variable, and it is equal to builder.configuration.getConnectionString, and this is the name of the connection string that we created just here. Then we need to call options.useSQL Server. And let's provide this method with the connection string. Then let's create a model that allows us to read and write the data from the database. So this model is called entity model because it allows us to create a table in the database. So first let's create a new folder. And let's call it models. Then let's create a new class. And let's call it event. Then let's add the different properties of this class. So we need the ID, which is the primary key of the event in the database. Then we have the title, the description, the start date, the end date. So the end date is optional. Then we have all day, which is a boolean, and we have created at. Then to create a table in the database using this model, we need to add a property in the application DB context class. So here let's create a new property of type dbSet. So we can create this property. It is called dbSet of event. So event that we have here is the entity model that we created. And the name of the property will be the name of the table in the database. So here we have this error, so we need to add the namespace. And now we have this warning, so to get rid of this warning, just here we can add required. Then let's create the events table in the database. So let's save all the files. Then let's go to Package Manager console. So first we need to create a migration file. So let's write add migration. And let's create a migration file called first migration, for example. So this migration file allows us to create the events table in the database. Then to create the table, we need to call update database. Now let's take a look at the database. So let's refresh the connection. And now we can see that we have this table that has these columns. Now let's fill this table with some data. So just here we can make a right click, then new query. And here let's write the SQL query that allows us to fill the events table with some data. So we can use this SQL query. So it allows us to insert some data in the events table. So here we can see that and is between double quotes because and is a reserved word. Now to execute this query, we can use this button. Let's close this page. And let's see the data of this table. So we can make a right click, then show table data. And you can see that we have these rows. Now let's create an API controller that allows us to perform CRUD operations on events. So let's close all the tabs. Then let's create a new API controller in the controllers folder. So let's select controller, then API, then API controller empty. And let's call it events controller. So this controller will be accessible at the URL that starts with /API/ the name of the controller without the controller word. So it will be accessible at the URL that starts with /API/events. And it is an API controller. So to read and write the events from the database, we need to request the application DB context from the application. So we need to add the constructor of this class. Then let's request the application DB context. Then let's save it into a field, so we can use this button. Then create and assign field context. Then let's create an endpoint that is accessible using the HTTP GET method that allows us to read the available events. So we can create this method. It is called action method and it is accessible using the HTTP GET method. So here we will read the available events using this context. So we will use the property events and we can order the available events by descending order of ID. So this parameter is of type event. Then we will return the list of events and we will return a success response with a list of the events. Then let's create another endpoint that allows us to read the event by ID. So we can create this action method. It is accessible using the HTTP GET method at the URL of the controller, which is /API/events/the event ID. So the event ID is a parameter that is available in the URL. So here we will read the event ID from the URL, then we will read the event having this ID. If the event is null, we will return not found, otherwise we will return a success response with the event details. So here I called the event EVT because event is a reserved word. So if we write event like this, it is a reserved word. So to get rid of this error, we can write it EVT, for example. Then we need to create another endpoint that allows us to create events. So first we need to create a DTO model that allows us to receive the event details from the client. So let's create a new model in the models folder. And let's call it event DTO. So this model is very similar to the event model, so we can copy the properties of the event model. But we will not copy the ID because it will be generated by the database and we don't need the created at because it will be defined on the server. So we can copy these properties. And let's paste them here. Also, we need to add validation annotations. So the title is required, so we need to decorate it with the required attribute. Also, the start date is required. So the description is optional, but we can define the maximum length of the description. So just here, we can add max length. And we can set the maximum length of the description to 500 characters. Then let's create the endpoint that allows us to create events. So we can create this action method. It is accessible using the HTTP post method at the URL of the controller, which is /API/events, and it requires data of type event DTO. So here we will create an object of type event. So we will set the title, the description, start date and all day using the data of event DTO. And we will set the created at property to the current date. Then we will add this event to the database using context.events.add, and this is the new event. And of course we need to save the modifications. Then we will return a success response with the new event details. Then let's create another endpoint that is accessible using the HTTP put method that allows us to update the event details. So we can create this method, edit event. It is accessible using the HTTP put method at the URL of the controller, which is /API/events/the event ID. So here we will read the ID from the URL and we will read the submitted data of type event.dtu. So first we need to read the event having this ID. If we don't have the event, we will return not found. Otherwise, we will update the event title, description, start date and all day using the data of event.dtu. Then we need to save the modifications in the database and we will return a success response that contains the updated event. And finally, let's create another endpoint that allows us to delete events. So we can create this action method. It is accessible using the HTTP delete method at the URL of the controller /the event ID. So here we will read the event ID from the URL, then we will read the event from the database. So we will read the event having this ID. If the event is null, we will return not found. Otherwise, we will delete this event from the database. So we can call context.events.remove. And this is the event that we want to delete. Then we will save the modifications and we will return a success response. Then let's run the application. So before running the application, let's take a look at the file launch settings that we have in the properties folder. And here we can see that we will use the HTTPS profile, which is this profile. So we will not open the browser and we will run the application at this URL. So this is the port number that will be used. We can use it, but I prefer to change it. So I will use the port number 4000. Now let's save all the files and let's run the application. And here we can see that the application is listening at this URL. So to test the application, we can use Postman. So let's open a new tab. Let's select the get method and let's provide the URL that allows us to read all the available events. Then let's click on send. So we obtain a success response. And here we have a list of events. So this is the event with the ID 9. Then we have this event, and this is the list of all the available events that we have in the database. And to read the event by ID, we can just add the event ID in the URL. So let's read the details of the event with the ID 8, for example. Then send. And now we have only the details of the event with the ID 8. Then let's create a new event. So we can open a new tab. Let's select the post method and let's provide the URL of the controller. Then we need to send the data of type event.dtu. So here let's select body, then row, and here let's select JSON. And let's provide the event data. So we need to provide the title and the start date. So the description is optional, the end date is optional. We can provide the value null or we can delete it. So here I will delete it. Then we have all day set to true. So if we remove the title, we should have a validation error. So let's remove the title and let's send the request. And here we have a bad request response. So we can see that the title is required. Now let's provide the title. And let's send the request. So now we have a success response and this is the details of the created event. So the new event has the ID 10. Now let's update this event. So let's update the title and let's provide the end date. So here let's select the put method. Let's provide the event ID. Let's update the title. And let's add the end date. Then send. So now we have a success response, and this is the updated event. So we have a new title and we have the end date. Then let's delete events. So we can open a new tab. Let's select the delete method. Let's provide the URL of the controller / the event ID. So we can delete the event with the ID 8, for example. So if I click on send, the first time we have a success response because the event has been deleted, and if we click on send again, this time we have not found. Now I will show you how to read the available events using a front-end application. So I already prepared this file. Let's take a look at the source code. And here we can see that we have this table. So in the table head, we have these columns. So we will display the event ID, the title, the description, the start date, the end date, the all day, and the created at. Then here we have the table body, which is currently empty. And this is the ID of the table body that allows us to fill the table body. Then here we have some JavaScript functions that will be executed when we open the page. So this method will be executed and it will send a GET request to this URL. And when we receive the data, we will call the method load table data and we will provide it with the data, which is the list of the events. So this is the method load table data. It requires the list of the events. Then we will read the table body by ID. And for every event that we have in this list, we will create a new table row. So in the first cell, we will display the event ID, then we will display the event title, then we will display the description, the start date, the end date, all day, and created at. Now let's open this file using the browser. But for the moment, we can see that the table is empty. Let's take a look at the console. And here we can see that we have this error, cross-origin request blocked. So to fix this error, we need to enable the course policy in our application. So let's stop the application. Let's go to program.cs. And let's configure the pipeline to enable course. So we need to add app.useCourse and we will allow any header, any method, and any origin. Let's run the application. Let's go to the browser and let's refresh the page. So this time we can see that we don't have the error anymore. And here we have the list of the events. Now let's create the Blazor application. So in this solution, let's create a new project. Then here let's scroll down and let's select Blazor WebAssembly standalone application. Then next, let's call it Blazor app. Then next. Then create. Then let's configure the solution to run the two projects together. So we can make a right click on the solution, then properties. Then let's select multiple startup projects. And here let's select start and here let's select start. Then OK. Now let's run the two projects. So we obtain this Blazor application. And here we have two consoles. So this is the console of the Web API. Here we have Web API. And this is the console of the Blazor application. Let's stop the two projects. And let's configure the Blazor application to connect to the Web API. So let's go to program.cs of the Blazor application. And let's configure the HTTP client to connect to the Web API. So we need the address of the Web API. So let's go to the project Web API, then launch settings, and let's copy this URL. Then let's provide it to the HTTP client. So we can delete this. And let's paste the address of the Web API. So this HTTP client is already added to the service container of the Blazor application. So later we can request it from the service container. Then let's create a new Blazor component that allows us to display the available events. So let's go to the Blazor application, then in the pages folder, let's create a new folder. And let's call it events. Then let's create a new component. So let's select Razor component and let's call it event list. Then let's define the URL of this component. So here let's add @page and let's provide the URL /events, for example. So when we go to this URL, we will display this component. We can change the title. We can use H1, for example. And let's use some bottom margin. Then let's add a link to this component in the nav menu. So the nav menu is available in the layout folder and it is called nav menu. And for the moment we have these 3 items. So let's copy this item. Let's provide the URL of this component, so we can copy it from here. And let's paste it here. And here let's write events. Then here let's add a Bootstrap icon. So let's go to the documentation website of Bootstrap. Let's go to the first link. Then icons. Then here let's write event. And let's use this icon. So let's click on it. So we can either use this element, but we need to include Bootstrap icons from the CDN, or we can use this code. So let's copy this code and let's use it instead of this span. So let's delete the span and let's paste the code. Let's run the project. So now we have this new item. Let's click on it and we obtain the event list component. Now I will show you how to display the available events in the event list component. So first we need to add the event model in the Blazor application. So here let's create a new folder and let's call it models. Then let's create the event model. So let's create a new class and let's call it event. Then we can copy the properties of this class from the Web API project. So let's copy the code of this model. We can copy these properties and let's add them here. Then in this component we need to request the HTTP client from the application. So just here we can inject the HTTP client to this component and we can call it HTTP. Then let's create a list of events that we will use to display the available events. So we can create it just here. So we can add this list of event objects that can be null and it is called events. So here we have this error. To fix it, we need to add the namespace of this class. So if we click here, we can just select this option. So we can see that this statement has been added here and the error is fixed. We can add the namespace either here or we can cut this code from here. And let's add it to the imports file. Like this, it will be added to all the components of the project. So here we can see that we don't have the error anymore. Then we need to send a request to the Web API to read the available events when the component is initialized. So we can override the method onInitializedAsync, and here we can read the available events from the Web API. So we will use this HTTP client and we will use the get method. So we will send a request to the URL /API/events, and we will read a list of event objects. Then we need to display the available events in the page. So just here we need to check if we have the list of events or not. So we will write a C# code. So we need to add then if condition, and we will check if events is null or not. So if events is null, we can display the text loading. Otherwise, we can create a button that allows us to create new events. So we can add this button with the text add event that will take us to the URL /events/create. So later we need to create a component that will be accessible at this URL. Then we need to create a table that will display the available events. So we can create this table. In the table head, we have these columns. So we will display the event ID, the title, the description, the date, whether it is all day or not, and we have the action column. So in this column, we will display two buttons, the edit button and the delete button. Then in the table body, we will display the available events. So for every event that we have in the events list that we received from the web API, we will create a new table row. So here we have a table row. So in this table row, we have the first cell that will display the event ID. In this cell, we will display the event title, then we will display the event description, then we will display the start date. Then we will check the value of all day. So if all day is true, we will display the text yes into this bootstrap badge. Otherwise, we will display no into this bootstrap badge. So this badge has the color green and this badge has the color yellow. Then in the last cell, we will display two buttons. This is the edit button and this is the delete button. So when we click on edit, we will go to this URL. So it is /events/edit/ the event ID. And later we need to create a component that will be accessible at this URL. And when we click on delete, for the moment, nothing happens. And later we need to implement the delete function. Let's run the application. Let's click on events. So here we have loading. And when we receive the data, we have the list of the events. Now I will show you how to create events. So first we need to create a DTO model that allows us to submit the data to the web API. So here in the Blazor application in the models folder, let's create a new model. And let's call it event DTO. Then we can copy the properties of the event DTO model that we have in the web API. So let's go to event DTO and let's copy the different properties without the validation annotations because the validation will be done on the web API. So let's copy this and let's paste the code here. Let's delete the validation annotations. So when we bind this model to the form, we need to display the current date as the start date. So we can provide this property with an initial value, which is the current date. Then let's create a new component that allows us to create events. So if we go to event list, we can see that this component should be accessible at this URL. So let's create a new component. And let's call it create. Then let's define the URL. So it is /events/create. Then let's create a property of type event DTO that we will associate to the form. So we can create this property and it is of type event DTO. Then let's create the form. So we can delete this HTML code. And let's add this row. So in this row we have this column, then we have the title of the page, new event. Then we have this row. So here we have a label with the text title, and we have this input field that allows us to provide the title of the new event. So we can see that this input field is associated to the title property of event DTO data. So this property is defined just here. Then we have another row for the start date, and we have this input field that is associated to the start date of event DTO data. Then we have this row for the end date, and we have this input field that is associated to the end date property of event DTO data. Then we have another row for the description, and here we have a text area that is associated to the description property of this property. Then we have this row. So in this row we have this input field which is of type checkbox, and it is associated to the all day property. And we have this label which is all day. And in the last row we have two buttons. So this is the first button, it is the save button, and this is the second button, so it is a bootstrap button, and it is the cancel button. When we click on cancel, we will go back to the list of events. And when we click on save, for the moment nothing happens. So now we need to add the onClick attribute to this button. So just here, let's add @onClick, and we need to call the method saveEvent. So for the moment we don't have this method. And to create this method we can use this button. Then let's generate an asynchronous method that is called saveEvent. So this method is added just here. And to implement this method, we need to request two services from the application. So we need to request the HTTP client and the navigation manager that allows us to redirect the user after creating a new event. Then we don't need this parameter, so we can delete it. And let's delete this statement. So this method should be asynchronous. So just here we need to add async. Then let's add the code that allows us to send a request to the web API to create a new event using the data of this event DTO data that is already associated to the form. So here we can send a post request to the web API using this HTTP client, and we will send the request to /API/events, and we will provide it with this object, event DTO data. So if we have a success response, we will redirect the user to the list of events. Otherwise, we will read the response of the web API and we will display it on the console of the browser. Let's run the application. Let's click on Add Event, and we obtain this component. So it is available at the URL /events/create. So we can see that we have this form, and the initial start date is the current date. So if we click on save without providing the title, we should have a validation error. So if we click on save, nothing happens, and if we check the console, we have the server response. So here we can see that we have the error key with the key title, and this is the validation error, so the title field is required. So now we need to read the value of the errors key from the response, and we need to display the validation errors in the form. So first let's create a new property that will store the validation errors. We can create it just here. And it is of type JSON node. So here we have an error. To fix it, we need just to add the namespace. Then let's store the validation errors in this property. So here we need to parse the server response, and we need to read the value of the errors key. If we don't have the errors key, then the value of this property will be new JSON object. Then let's display the different validation errors in the form. So first let's display the validation error related to the title. So just here we can add a span. So here we will display the validation error related to the title, and we will display the first validation error. and we will display the error using the red color. Then let's do the same thing with the start date. So here we will display the validation error related to the start date, the end date, and the description. Let's run the application. Let's click on Add Event. Then let's submit the form. So here we can see that the title field is required. Now let's fill the form correctly. Then save. So here we can see that this event has been created and we are redirected to the list of events. Now I will show you how to update the event details. So when we click on the edit button, we will go to the URL /events/edit/ we have the event ID. So now we need to create a new component that will be accessible at this URL. So let's create it here. And let's call it edit. Let's define the URL of this component. So it is /events/edit/ we have the event ID. So we can create this parameter called ID, which is of type integer. Then let's create a property called ID that will be used to store the event ID from the URL. We can create it just here. So we will initialize this property from the parameter of this URL. Then we need to create additional properties. So we need the event data. It is of type event that can be null, and it should contain the event details of the event that we want to update. Then we have event DTO data that we need to associate to the form, and we have this errors property that will contain any validation error. So to fix this problem, we need just to add the namespace. Then we need to request two services from the application. So we need the HTTP client and the navigation manager. So when we read the event ID from the URL, we need to send a request to the web API to receive the event data. So we need to override the method onParameters_setAsync. Then we need to send a GET request to the web API using the HTTP client. And here we will send the request to /API/events/ the event ID. So we will read the event details of the event having this ID. Then we need to display the event details in the form. So we need to save the event details in event DTO data that is associated to the form. So we will set the title, description, start date, and all day using the data of this event data that we received from the web API. Then let's create the form. So the form is very similar to the form that we have in the create component. So we can copy all of this row. And let's use it here. So let's delete this H3 element and let's paste the row. Let's change the title so we can write edit event. Then let's display the form only when we receive the event details. So just here we need to add an if condition. So let's add @if. So if event data is null, we can display the text loading. Otherwise, we can display the form. So let's cut the form. And let's paste it in the else block. Also, we need to display the event ID. So we can copy this row. Let's paste it here. So here in the label we can write event ID. We don't need this span, so let's delete it. And this input field should be of type read only. So here let's change the class. Let's add plain text. And let's add read only. Then we don't need this attribute, so let's delete it and let's replace it with value. So the value will be the event ID that we have in the URL, and it is also available in the ID property. So let's add @ID. So here when we click on save, we need to execute the method save event, but for the moment we don't have it. So now let's implement this method. So we can copy this method from the create component. So this is the method save event. Let's copy it. And let's paste it here. So here we will send the request using the put method. So here let's write put, and let's add the event ID in the URL. So let's add slash plus the ID of the event. Let's run the application. So let's update this event with the ID 11. Then let's update the title and the start date. Then save. So here we can see that the title and the date have been updated. Now I will show you how to delete events. So let's go to the event list component, and here we have the delete button. So when we click on this button, we need to delete the event. So first let's create a method that allows us to delete events. Let's create it in the code section. So we can create the method delete event, and it requires the event ID. So it is asynchronous, and first we will send a delete request to the web API to delete the event having this ID. And after deleting the event, we need to read the new events to update the list of the events. So here we can store the available events into this field, and we will send a GET request to the web API, and of course we will read a list of event objects. Then we need to call this method when we click on the delete button. So this is the delete button, and just here we need to add @onClick. Then we need to call the method delete event. So this method is asynchronous and it requires the event ID. So because it is asynchronous, here we have to add async, and we will create an arrow function. Then we will call the method delete event. So this method is asynchronous, so just here we have to add await. Then we need to provide this method with the event ID. Let's run the application. Then let's delete the event with the ID 9. So here we can see that the event has been deleted and the list of the events has been updated. In the next video, I will show you how to display an alert before deleting an event and how to display the events into an agenda. You can find the link of the next video in the description.